Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video, I'm continuing my analysis into medical ethics. Specifically, I'll be using this book. Hold on 1 second. I'll be using this book, Classic Works in Medical Ethics. So this is a book that I'll be using today. The section that I'm covering today is section 3.0 in my notes. As you guys know by now, if you want to access the notes, just click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. I've recently updated the lecture notes, so make sure you get the most up-to-date version of the notes. The topic today that I'm going to be covering is, I was a bit apprehensive at first, but then I said, there needs to be social discourse on the topic. It's covered in the text, so I didn't want to avoid the topic, and the topic is one of suicide. I recognize the sensitivity of this issue. Almost all of us know someone or in some sense have been affected by suicide. Me personally, in undergrad, I had a suite mate that I was rather close with who at the time broke up with his girlfriend and drove to the middle of the St. Pete Bridge in Tampa and jumped off the bridge and killed himself. And I knew him well. I mean even more recently, and it was I wouldn't use the word devastating, but it affected me a lot more. Was at USF. I had a professor that was mentoring me. I actually formally got accepted for dual graduate degrees, a PhD in philosophy, but also a dual master's in Africana studies. And I was doing a lot of research on traditional African religion and such, and I taught classes in the Africana Studies department. And my mentor and former chair of the Africana Studies department, in the middle of our mentorship, he killed himself. And that left me completely sort of lost, right? And he was in prime health. But he killed himself. And, I had to sort through that, a second time. And then, people and family and so on, way more personal. So I've had quite a bit of exposure to personal accounts, my own personal account of people who have decided to take their lives. And the idea is I do broach this topic with a high degree of sensitivity, right? It is still, meaning the act of suicide and the contemplation of the ethical, psychological, philosophical, social implications of suicide is still open for intellectual analysis. So I'm not going to, because of the sensitivity of the topic or my own personal experiences with people who have decided to take their own lives, I'm not going to water down the lecture in any sense. I just wanted to begin the lecture by saying I recognize fully the sensitivity of the topic, and watch or don't watch this section, which is section 3 of the analysis in medical ethics, with with that notion in mind, with that disclaimer in mind. Okay, so this is my medical ethics series. And this is section 3. Okay, so this is section 3 of the analysis. Let me try and get a better marker. I need to buy some new markers. Alright, so section 3 begins at the bottom of page 7. We're going to be looking at Jerome A. Motto's The Right to Suicide, a Psychiatrist's View. It's on page 67 to 72 of the text that I just showed you before. So, as the title of the analysis says, of Motto's article says, it's the right to suicide, right? We're going to be looking at the right to suicide. Alright, so here's a quote directly from the text, right? Motto says, "The question as to whether a person has the right to cope with pain in his world by killing himself can be answered without hesitation. He does have that right." So the initial question, does an individual have the right to take his or her own life? The answer is yes, right? According to Motto, individuals do have the right to I'll just put just commit suicide. Individuals do have the right to commit suicide. At the top of page 8, this is a very important point. It is only when philosophical and theological questions are raised that one can find room for argument about the right to suicide, as only in these areas can restrictions on behavior be institutionalized, right? Only in these areas can restrictions on behavior be institutionalized without requiring social or legal support. Okay? So the point is, individuals do have the right to take their lives, right? So what Motto is saying is that the individual does have right to suicide. And the attempt is, as we see at the top of page 8, that when we're talking about philosophical, theological questions, within the discourse of philosophy and theology, these paradigms allow for potentially restrictions, right? On that right. Right? There might be possible restrictions on that right. And the question is, how could you justify a possible restriction on a right that a human being has to determine whether or not he or she wants to continue living? How do you force someone to continue living when that individual wants to die? It's a very complicated question, right? And again, I've done a lecture series on euthanasia, and the idea is if an individual, because of pain or because of psychological torment, wants to end his or her life, how is it that we find mechanisms to restrict the right that they already have? What's important to recognize here is that individuals within the psychiatric, philosophical, medical community, some aspects of the philosophical community, already legitimately recognize the right to suicide. If individuals within the institution recognize the right to suicide, why is it then that those same institutions potentially could restrict the right? And as we'll see later, is that there's often a call or a cry for help, right? There's often a call or a cry for help. It can be as literal as picking up a suicide hotline phone number and calling them and saying, hey, I've contemplated, taking my life, or calling a friend, at which point there is the possibility of intervention. For those people who don't seek to share their thoughts with others, there really is no possibility for intervention, and there's really nothing that can be done. So if we're talking about restrictions, or if we're talking about prevention, you have to recognize that both restrictions and prevention assume some degree of disclosure by the individual who is intent on taking his or her own life. Okay, so as only in these areas can restrictions on behavior be institutionalized without requiring social or legal support. Okay, so two dilemmas arise which stem from an individual's right? So we have a right to suicide, and we're going to put two dilemmas. The first is, quote, what is the extent to which the exercise of that right should be subject to limitations? Right? The question is, if we recognize, this is a conditional, right? If we recognize that an individual has a right, then the question becomes, to what extent are we justified in limiting that right? And this is a much broader discourse, right, on the relationship between rights and duties. And just briefly, I want to situate it in that discourse so that you can recognize the very nuanced way in which we can conceptualize the possibility of limiting an individual's right that is recognized, right? So, how, I'll just put it like this, how are rights, right, how are rights limited? This is a rather sort of generalized question.